So tonight, libertarianism. As I was digging into this, you guys ever hear the name Jay Richards? He's a political philosopher. He got kind of well known for his work on intelligent design. He's one of these PhDs that truly is what they call a Renaissance man. He knows a little bit about economics, a little bit about philosophy, a little bit about science, and he learns all these things so he can bring it together at a high level and teach it. And he's trying to say that you have to integrate your knowledge. The world is not compartmentalized where your beliefs about this don't have any effect on your this over here in your life. No, they all work together. Hi. Jay Richards was the guy I was hoping that we'd be able to stream tonight, like we had done before. But the next best thing is he and I were, I called him, we were emailing back and forth, and he gave me some content ideas, and then he led me to a video of his. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes watching his presentation at the Acton Institute about do libertarians need God, I think was the name of the talk. And so it's going to get kind of deep at certain parts because he's talking to a group called the Acton Institute, which is a think tank up in Michigan, and very high level political philosophy. So the crowd knew what he was talking about. So there are a few things that he might say that you haven't heard before. So I wanted to go through those. First of all, this is funny. I wasn't texting and driving it from Florida, but I was writing and driving it at certain times. So yeah, on my notepad here, is that libertarianism? Yeah. It was all in good shape until Brooke was sitting on it as we were getting out the car, and I pulled on it and it ripped. So, libertarianism is to be distinguished from the Libertarian Party. We have the Republican, the Democratic, and the Libertarian parties, and there are other Socialist Party and others here in America. But those are the three big ones, right? The big and the Green Party, I guess, is starting to get a little bit bigger. But Libertarian Party is gaining a lot of ground in America, even amongst Christians. We have a good friend, Jenny and I do, really good friend from Michigan, diehard Libertarian. I'm talking about Tim. I mean, we were surprised, really. He's a pastor, very educated. He's just finished his doctorate degree, but he's really into libertarianism. We may even have libertarians in this class here. I know we have libertarians in our church. So the question is, what do you do with that? How is that different than the conservative positions? Now, conservative doesn't mean Republican. Liberal doesn't mean Democrat. Libertarian doesn't mean Libertarian Party. The three, conservative, liberal, and libertarianism, are philosophies. These are philosophies that are trying to explain reality. So the question is, which one of them gets it right, or do any of them get it right? Maybe they're all wrong. Just like we've learned in everything, what the definition of truth is, everything we've done, science, history, a statement is true if it corresponds to reality, right? It doesn't matter what the person's character is that was saying it. Doesn't matter, how they came to believe it. They were taught that. That's the only reason they believe it. None of that matters. Is the statement true? Means does it correspond with reality? So it's the same thing with politics. It's the same thing with economics and culture. It's a lot easier. This is something that Jay Richards encouraged me to do. He said, libertarianism is a huge ball of individual beliefs and positions. He said you can't tackle libertarianism in one swoop. He says, so peel out the different teachings that they have about this, about that, different figures within the libertarian tradition, and talk about them in isolation. And then you can kind of piece together your own take on where you stand with libertarianism. But the big question, first talk about libertarianism, Libertarian Party. Jay Richards is going to talk about something called materialism. Now, on a pop level, we all grew up hearing that person is really materialistic. Madonna's a material girl. What that means in our regular language is that person is greedy, right? That person just wants a lot of stuff. They're shopaholics. They love their toys. That is not what the philosophy of materialism is. So Jay Richards, in the video clip we're going to see a little bit later, talks about materialists. He's not talking about people who like to shop. He's talking about this belief that the material world is all there is. That's what materialism teaches. So you can see that if the material world is all there is, then this stuff here that's all Eric is. There's nothing to describe me more than my molecules. There's no soul. There's nothing, obviously, that survives the body because there's no soul. There's certainly no God in materialism. There are no angels. There's nothing immaterial. That's the belief of materialism. And libertarianism has a lot of materialists in their ranks. There's a debate about whether or not you have to be a materialist to be a libertarian. They debate that all the time. Jay Richards, he lives outside of D.C., and the libertarians in D.C. are adamant that you should be an atheist, that you should be a materialist, and that's the best system. Which brings me to the last person's name on there. That's actually a person. Her name is Ayn Rand. Did anybody ever hear that name before?
Yes.
Yes.
You know, the book she wrote? What's her famous book?
Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah,
Atlas Shrugged. Just got made into part one, part two, major movie. Yep, she was a novelist. The interesting thing about Ayn Rand is that she was raised in the Soviet Union, where they were socialist to the extreme, obviously, and they were atheist in their socialism. Communism, Marxism requires atheism. So she was raised as an atheist, but as a socialist. She hated socialism. She saw how bad it was. It didn't work. It was a mess. She developed a severe hatred for anything socialist, and she started to learn about capitalism and said, "This is it. This is how people should be organized in an economy." She got out. I don't remember her story how she got out, but she got out of the Soviet Union and came to America. The interesting thing about her is she kept the atheism. So she was loving capitalism, but she hates religion, which is weird. So she carried some of the stuff that the Bolsheviks taught her, but not the economics. So she got popular because I think she allowed people who didn't want to be like us, crazy Christians, but they also recognized that, that stuff like socialized medicine, it doesn't work. People die quicker and live less fulfilled lives physically. That's just, they see it, they see the reality, but they don't want to be conservatives. So what's the halfway? Libertarianism. Now that's a certain type of libertarian. Now she went as far as to say this. Is anybody, I always have to bring up movies. Because
Yes, I've seen them all.
Ever seen Wall Street with Michael Douglas? This is from 1980s movie now.
Yeah.
Remember that one where he was, the famous line at the end of that movie when he was giving a speech, I can't remember the audience he was in front of, but he was defending capitalism and people saying, shouldn't make that much money on stocks and bonds and other commodities trades. And he was saying, no, people should make as much money as they want, as they can, if they make it. And he said at the end, his famous line is, "Greed is good." Remember that line? It was in all the promos. It was the famous line. Greed is good. That whole speech he gave was Ayn Rand. She says that capitalism is the best system, and capitalism depends on greed. If you're greedy and you're greedy, you're both going to try to satisfy your own greed. You're going to be selfish. And because you're being selfish, you're going to try harder, and the two competing greeds will cancel each other out, or the better way of doing it because of greed will win. So you say you both want to bring shoes to the market because you're greedy, you want to make a lot of money. Well, the better one's going to sell more shoes. So out of greed, you're going to make a better shoe, which means the consumer now has a better shoe to buy. And that was her argument. See, greed helps the consumer, it helps people. So you can see, man, there's some truth there about competition and the need to both try really hard out of, is it greed or what?
Maybe it's not greed. Maybe it's survival of the fittest or something.
Oh, so you're a Darwinist.
Well, no, I mean, maybe this person was more intelligent. He made a better shoe.
Right, and I'll tell you what Jay Richards says, 'cause he doesn't bring it up in this talk, but he has, I think, the best way to solve it. But what she says is this: since greed fuels economics, you need greed. You need to make people more greedy. And Christianity teaches you not to be greedy, but to be selfless, think of others, to be involved in charity. She said charity is the worst thing for capitalism because it rewards failure, it rewards someone doing something poorly. That was her argument. In Christianity, man, that's a killer for capitalism, because people are going around and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and taking care of the sick who can't afford it. Let them die. Let them, that's the natural, what should happen. You can see Darwin in there too, natural selection of economics. So she spent her life trying to undermine Christianity while propping up capitalism, which is weird because we're so pro-markets, right? As Christians in general, we're very conservative on our economics. And we see that actually is the right way to believe based on our Christianity. She was saying the exact opposite and worked hard. And many libertarians, the people who did Atlas Shrugged, very much anti-Christian in the sense of Christians having this negative influence in society by promoting charity and selflessness. What is it? Here's what he says. Here's what Jay Richards wrote me back. What secularists in D.C. mean by the word is quite different from what, say, evangelical supporters of Ron Paul in Texas. A lot of Christians stand behind Ron Paul. So it makes it hard to, it's hard to understand because depending who you're promoting. Ron Paul, okay, well, do we want legalized prostitutes? Because that's what he promoted. He was actually endorsed by the prostitutes in wherever their union is in Las Vegas. They endorsed him. That's not a very Christian thing that we want. But he also talks about low taxes. He talks about the government staying out of people's business. Well, we like that. So, and that's what Jay was saying. Jay Richards was saying is that the problem is not every libertarian will say that. There are degrees of libertarian. It's a huge, and they'll even admit it. I'm going to play 2 video clips by libertarians. They're short video clips of them arguing for libertarianism. And you'll hear in there that, all right, there isn't one of them flat out says that you can't say what libertarianism is, because do they want government at all? I mean, there are anarchist levels of libertarians, and then there are libertarians that basically look like conservatives. Well, what's the difference between that and conservatism? So one of them is, that's the best way I think to understand, what's the difference between liberals and libertarians and conservatives and libertarians? I think the first one is natural law. If anyone was here the first week, and Diana did the law of natural law, which is the feminism and gender. Natural law is that which can be known about man, God, reality, without any other revelation from a book. It's what God has given to mankind. And that's what in Romans 1 and Romans 2 says that's why God can hold all people accountable. Because he's given them natural law. They can't say, well, I never read the Bible. He's like, I revealed myself. I'm in nature. I'm in science. I'm in art. There are things I've revealed that you know because you have a brain and you have senses. That's how I made you. That's called natural law, meaning it's natural for a person to understand that there are certain things that are right and wrong. Natural law is what our founding fathers based their rebellion against the crown of England. They said, King George, you violated this law that's higher than you, and that gives us the right to sever our tie with you. But it doesn't give us the right, like the French Revolution, to just make ourselves tyrants in your place. We're under natural law too, and that was the difference between French and American Revolution. The French Revolution was just, every man will be a king. No, that's actually the opposite of what we were arguing. There shouldn't be a king in a totalitarian sense. So our founding fathers, most of them were Christian, but not all of them. Some significant ones were not. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others. They said natural law is what you violated, so we're going to separate from it. But when we build a new country here called the United States of America, we will base it on natural law, the one that we say you violated. So that's what we're founded on, is natural law, not the Bible in a direct sense. And the reason is important, because not everybody's a Christian, and you're never going to have 100% Christianity in a cultural country. And so the only theocracy that's ever been legitimate in all of mankind is Israel, ancient Israel. When God founded Israel, and he was in charge when they walked into the land, Joshua. That's the only time in human history that someone can say we're a theocracy, God's in control. And that's because God said it, not because they wanted to do it. So that's one, natural law. The conservative political thought recognizes natural law, and the libertarian political thought recognizes natural law. But they don't ground it largely. They just say natural law. Whereas the conservative position is, we know from our senses and from reality there's a God. Mankind is accountable to this God. That accountability brings about this thing called natural law. You see this argumentation that leads them to there. Libertarians just start with natural law. So we can agree with them on, yeah, there's natural law, but they can't ground it in anything. Because as soon as they do, they're going to become conservative. So that's how it's hard to understand sometimes the difference. But here's where I thought, so one difference is they start with natural law. I say we, because I don't know if everyone here would call themselves a political conservative, but philosophical conservative. That's what we argue for in apologetics and philosophy. We argue for natural law. So that's one difference. The other difference is libertarians, by and large, see government as a necessary evil. It's awful. Anyone having any control over you is awful. But we have to have some, because we need people to fight wars and protect us from enemies out there. We need police to protect us from enemies in here. And for the third one, they said they need, they very limited. Government should be doing just 3 things essentially. Oh, and a judiciary to figure out who the enemies are. That's how they usually say it.
Wow.
That's their mantra. And so minimal amount of government because it's a necessary evil. Conservative political thought says that government is ordained by God. And so you see the difference. If you're a libertarian, you have this disdain as you obey your government with this sense of like, I'm gonna cut you off at the first thing you do that ticks me off, you're done. That's kind of the attitude as they're obeying their laws. Conservative says, I'm obligated because God put you there over me, even bad governments. Romans 13 talks about obeying the Roman emperor. I mean, how awful can they have been? They make us look, like choir kids. Stuff that Rome was into, the emperors. Nero, they were to obey Nero. So that's conservative political thought, that government is good. But because mankind is sinful, government, just like every human, every body of humans or individual, need to be checked. So that's where you can see the departure there at that point. Checks and balances means something very different in conservative thought than it does in liberal thought, or libertarian thought. So I think those are the 2 big ones, Jen. I'm telling you, I was interacting with Jay, and you can't, there's no definition that every libertarian would say, yeah, that's what we are. So it's difficult. So, and then proper end. He's going to talk about ends in this video that we're going to show. And that's something that we're not used to talking like. It's a way we're not used to talking. So an end would be, Aristotle talked about it, and it meant, all it means is, what is this thing for? What is its end? So a cow, the end purpose of a cow is to produce milk and make a hamburger. I mean, you can have different ends for, proper end of man. This is in the, if you are from a Reformed tradition, do you ever have to memorize, what is the chief end of man? And you have to respond to it. Right. The chief end, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this Aristotelian category called the final cause, or the why, where you're going, what's the end purpose of you. So when he talks about ends, the proper end of being a human, what is it? And this is another point that libertarians differ from conservatives. Libertarians, they'll say it, I'll just tell you so you can repetition. Libertarians think mankind is its own end. So you are, as an individual, Sheila, you are your own end. So anything that violates that, from somebody telling you what to do, what you can't do, that's violating the proper end of Sheila. We kind of agree with that as conservatives, but we say no, the proper end is God. That's where the Westminster Confession says that, to know God and glorify Him forever. God is the ultimate expression of why we're human. And so see the difference between, they want to say mankind, it's almost a humanism would be comfortable with that belief. That's not true. And so you always have a lack. If you're a person that thinks you're the end in of yourself, you could be Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or whatever, and you're still going to be looking for something. Because that's not the end of what it means to be human, to have financial happiness and independence and power or whatever it is. So that's another difference. So he'll talk about that a lot in the video. So I will show two short videos, which I found interesting because I was, again, with libertarians, I feel like saying amen, I feel like saying shut up at the same time. Like, yes, yes, no, yes, no. It's frustrating. So these videos, these are good guys. They're trying to be fair, and I like them. I just didn't agree with them.
What is it to be a libertarian? Well, first of all, I would say that being a libertarian does not involve any kind of substantive moral commitment. Libertarianism is essentially a political doctrine. It's a doctrine about the nature of human beings, the nature of human society, and the kind of human society that is most conducive to human flourishing. Libertarians believe that the most important thing in life is human flourishing, human well-being, human happiness, if you will. They also argue that human beings are ultimately autonomous, self-defined, choosing individuals, and that the kind of social order which is most conducive to the widest and most diverse range of human flourishing is one in which the role of power and government is kept to the minimum. Now, this does not mean, however, that they need to support a particular moral code or anything like that. It's perfectly possible for someone who is a traditional Christian, someone who is a complete atheist, to both be libertarian in the way that I've just described. What does this mean for certain particular policy issues? Are there any kind of specific major questions of politics that really you have to take a certain position on if you're to be a consistent libertarian? There are a few, certainly. It's certainly the case, for example, that you have to support free markets, you have to support free trade, you have to support the free movement of people, you have to support free speech, you have to support constitutional and limited government, you have to be opposed to coercive paternalism and things of that sort. However, there are a number of policy positions where it's not clear what exactly you have to believe if you're to be a consistent and principled libertarian. In foreign policy, for example, many libertarians think that the consistent position is to be a non-interventionist, but in fact I think it's perfectly possible to be a libertarian and to advocate a more interventionist foreign policy. That's not my own view, but I don't think that those who have it are ipso facto not libertarians. Another is abortion, where I think it's perfectly possible for consistent and sincere libertarians to be either pro or opposed to that particular policy option. The fact that libertarians can hold opposed views on a wide range of policy issues is an indication that this is not a cult or some kind of rigid creed, but rather a diverse and complex philosophy in which a whole number of positions can be held by people who share certain essential underlying presumptions and beliefs. And it's also a sign of intellectual vitality and the continuing evolution of the ideas. There are two responses you can make to the accusation that libertarianism is a politically irrelevant creed which condemns you to complete lack of importance for politics. The first is the one that economists make, which is that as a single voter, you are already completely irrelevant to the political process. The chance that your vote is actually going to have any effect upon the process or be decisive in any way is minimal. You've probably got a greater chance of winning the lottery. And therefore, you should simply be what you believe and vote the way you believe as well. The other thing is this. Political positions or sets of beliefs that are marginalized or held by only a small number of people in given times are not condemned to remain that way. The evidence of history is that it is possible for small but dedicated and organized groups of people to have a disproportionately large effect upon the political process and upon public debate. And there are many, many examples of this. And I think that that's what you should always hold to if you're a libertarian or indeed a member of any unpopular political persuasion.
Any thoughts on his?
What is libertarianism? Well, the way I see libertarianism, first I have to say that if you get 10 libertarians in a room, you're going to get 11 different views as to what libertarianism is. It's sort of like herding cats or something. So my own view is that libertarianism is either a two-edged sword or two sides of the same coin. And on one side of the coin is the non-aggression principle, and on the other side of the coin is private property rights. The non-aggression principle is pretty non-controversial. All it says is keep your bloody mitts to yourself. Don't grab other people or their property without their permission. Now, if you ask the next 100 people that walk down the street, Do you favor murder, rape, and theft? You know, they'll say, of course not. And even if they do, they won't admit it. But the difference between libertarianism and other people is that we're really serious about that. We apply it to everything. We apply it to other people, other institutions, including government. The way I see libertarianism, the essence of it is anarcho-capitalism, because the government itself is a violator of the non-aggression principle, because it tells people you have to pay taxes whether you like it or not. And then there are these excuses, well, if you live here, you know, you've implicitly agreed. I didn't implicitly agree to anything like that. I never signed any constitution or any agreement that other people can take my money and give it to other people. It's just theft. If anyone else were to do it and not calling themselves government, we would know clearly that it's a violation of the non-aggression principle. But somehow government is free of this problem. The way I see libertarianism, there are like 3 or 4 stages. The highest is anarcho-capitalism, which applies the non-aggression principle to everything with no excuses, no exceptions, including government. The second, one level down, would be minarchism or minimal government libertarianism, which says, okay, there is a role for the government, and the role for the government is to protect persons and property. And to that end, there are only 3 institutions that are justified: armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and courts to tell who the good guys and who the bad guys are. People associated with the first, anarcho-capitalism, would be Murray Rothbard, for example. People associated with the second one would be Ayn Rand and Ron Paul.
All right, so his was a little less agreeable, I would think, for most Christians. I mean, we have Jesus explicitly saying pay your taxes in the gospel, so it's a little hard for most Christians to hear that taxes are somehow theft. Boy, that's tough, because I don't know if Jesus would say render unto Caesar if that's how it was. And then in Romans 13 it flat out says pay your taxes, obey your leaders. And then they give the example in Acts where unless it's to violate, you know, to deny Christ, and you know clearly that that means you're going to be put in jail or executed. And those Christians said, I understand, and I stand with Christ. So there's room in the Christian worldview to be conscientious objectors, like Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, that's what he said. Your laws are immoral, and I'm not going to obey them. But I'm not going to disobey every law, just the immoral ones. There's a difference there. So, Eric, you had your hand up.
I'm just thinking about some of the stuff I've heard about in the last 10 years, grazing rights, you know, so you get ranch owners and disputes with the government, and government takes maybe land away or land rights away from what they traditionally would let their cattle graze. Some of them always seem very libertarian to me, and how, I would just say, I wouldn't say militant, but they're very aggressive in their stance towards what the government just did. And some of it, they're right. The government probably did some things they shouldn't have and taken it, but it's the stance that they take that's probably a little different than maybe how somebody who's conservative might have handled the same situation.
Right. Because the one he was describing, that first level he talked about, would accuse conservative thinkers as being pushovers, basically. But conservatives say, no, we're just, the principle is the government does have rights, and actually that's not even the right word, is mandated by God Almighty to do certain things in society. One of them, it says clearly in Romans 13, punish wrongdoers, put to death people who have risen to a level. I mean, it says that in Romans, in the end of Romans, and he says it in another one of the epistles. I mean, it's explicit. So that's what God put government here for. There are only 3 institutions that are sanctioned by God Almighty. The family was the first one in Genesis. And then you have Israel, or the church, the spiritual body, and the government. Those are the only 3 things that God put on earth to govern over humanity. Which is why we as conservatives are so pro-family, because if you undermine the very first one, you know, gay marriage undermines that. The no-fault divorce, where it makes it too easy. You hear conservative positions about this. You know, Jim Dobson and others would be examples. That's why, because they're saying you're attacking the very first foundation of a society, and it will crumble if you undermine the family. So there is no family unit. and the whole, what do they call it, the tribe, the village, and it takes a village. That concept of taking a village to raise children is not, what God mandated. He mandated the family to raise children, and then the community around it support and stand behind the parents. So that's the conservative position, whereas the libertarian position would be they wouldn't recognize those three institutions as being ordained by God. Certainly not government. See, in their view, the individual is autonomous, is ultimate. We're saying no, the family is ultimate in terms of organizing yourselves in a society.
I think the way you're describing government, though, is all-inclusive, and in reality, I mean, there's ranges of government from little government.
Like local versus state versus federal, or
less
the
organized.
power they have.
Yes, the power they have. And certainly, if you look at it from a biblical point of view, it wasn't a democratic government or a communist government. It was a king or a judge. I mean, and so that form of government, which the world had for, and still has in some cases, for thousands of years, has been transitioned as we've moved into democracy and republics or communist states. So then it's not just government per se, but it's what is the role of government and how broad should it be? Because the broader it is, the more constraints it puts on individuals, families, or others, telling you do this, don't do this. And how much more money it takes from you, takes away your freely earned income to do what it wants to do. And so I see the libertarians, and in a sense the conservatives to a degree, wanting to minimize the role of the government. I don't think they're against government per se. They just don't want more government. They want less government.
And that's like he was saying, those three tiers.
Yes.
You're talking about the second tier there. That would describe the Ayn Rands and the Ron Pauls. And yeah, that's exactly what they say.
Within that context,
Right.
yes. And I think also, I mean, you didn't contrast it with the liberals per se, but the liberals would say, I think, that having larger government is good because we can do things for people. Where the libertarians are saying, don't do anything for people, let people do what they want for themselves. Don't take it from them, let them do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the conservatives would say, well, there is some role because there's some people who are not able to do it.
We don't want people to
Right.
support, we don't want to support them smoking pot and prostituting themselves.
Right.
And so as conservatives, we say, we want to step in as a society and put roadblocks between you and those decisions.
Or assistance, whether it's Social Security or something. Where
Yeah, you can
helping
argue about
people-
what degree.
Yeah, what
Right.
becomes the degrees. And I think the libertarians' degrees is really the least.
A lot more minimal.
Yes.
And I think the key difference there is, because you're right, conservatives, I'm extremely concerned about the nanny state. It's,
Sure.
I mean, Jenny and I have done a lot of work in Russia, and I've seen firsthand the fallout of communism. It stinks. It's
Sure.
horrible.
Sure.
So I'm very passionately against it. But remember the ends. What is the chief end of a person? It's not themselves. So they would say, don't do these things to people because they're their own end.
Yes.
Whereas a conservative would say, no, you're standing in the way between them and what God wanted them to be. When you take away someone's ability to work,
A Christian conservative.
well,
you could
natural
be
law.
conservative, yeah, but
Natural
you could
law
be conservative
conservatives.
without being a Christian.
True. And right, like but Thomas Jefferson, his wording, you probably know this, that his wording for the original version of the Declaration of Independence was more Christian sounding. Benjamin Franklin said, endowed by their creator, how about that? Inalienable rights. You know, he dialed back the wording a little bit because it was too Christian, religious sounding, and Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. Clearly, he was very clear about that. So the what I think what you're saying there is, and that's why we can lock arms with libertarians and
To a degree,
conservatives
yes.
on so many things.
Yeah.
Like Jenny and I were at the first two Tea Party things here in Charlotte before there was a Tea Party as a political entity. It's interesting to me that the libertarians, I was looking at some other sources, claim credit for the Tea Party. I was like, man, most of the people I was talking to there were straight up conservatives. They're just, we're just saying, look, we do not agree with socialism. It is theft. Now, I'm not going to not pay my taxes because of that position, and that would be a difference there too. But I will fight for what I believe is right. But again, because God made humanity to be, there's something called human nature. And anything that stands in between the individual and that human nature that they need to obtain to is wrong. It needs to be resisted. That's the conservative position. So if the government's coming in there and undermining that person, that person's ability to provide for themselves, that's why they were made, to till the ground, to work the earth, to account for their work, their earnings. These are all biblical principles that God gave us all. So I'm going to resist anything that stops a person from reaching that. This is why I'm against, nanny state. But they're going to do it for other reasons, but we can still fight together on those policies. It does get tricky when, you're talking about individual policies. We sound like we're saying the same thing, but for different reasons, and those reasons are pretty big difference.
I think the ends are very different. Their end is for personal satisfaction and achievement.
Or
the conservative,
if they want to be
Christian
lazy, they actually will say, that person wants to be lazy, so that's their end. That's the end they're working toward. Whereas the conservatives say, no, that's hurting that person. If that person wants to prostitute themselves, they would say, they do say this, let them do it. That's what they want to do. Why do you want to stand in their way? That's their end. Conservatives would say, no, that's not what sex was made for, and we need to, as a society, stand between a person and bad choices. Not in most of the choices won't put a gun to their heads, but we stand between them and try and make it difficult to do the wrong thing. And so there's a difference there, and we're saying, no, human nature, created by God, humans are supposed to be a certain thing, and we need to encourage that and peel away whatever we can that stands in between people and what we're meant to be. And that's, I think, the key difference. And we're going to do Jay Richards now, and he gets into that even deeper. I want you to hear these two guys first, to hear what, they sound largely reasonable, right? But then they say one thing, and you're like, oh man, like I said, you're amening and you're telling them this. Jen, you've met Jay a few times too, right? He's
Director of Research at the Acton Institute.
Yeah.
Welcome to this. It's going to be a very interesting lecture on a subject which...
What I like, what I've admired is that he's come to the conferences, he's Catholic, he's all about unity, and he just loves people.
The interesting thing, I actually asked him, I'll just share this. He is Catholic, but he's a super conservative political philosopher, economic philosopher. And their current pope has said a lot of things that are very socialist. Yeah. And so I asked him at the conference 2 years ago, I said, what do you guys do? I mean, you and I named a few others that are super conservative and great philosophers to argue for conservative principles. And, what do you do? Because are you obligated to follow what he says? And he said, no. He goes, look, if the Pope says something that has to do with the church or theology, I have to listen to it. For everything else, he can go jump in a lake. He didn't quite say it that bad, but you could see there was a fire behind him, like, Pope, what are you doing? We're doing all this hard work as Catholic thinkers to argue for free markets and all that, and you're telling the whole world that socialism is the bomb. So.
Sounds like I'm really old though, so it wasn't really that long ago, but it was before Acton occupied this fantastic space. And so this, honestly, as Sam said, I live in the DC area now, and so I'm in the offices of a lot of think tanks. And this, in terms of just the sort of aesthetic appeal and the working environment, is as wonderful as any place I've seen. In fact, there's some much larger think tanks that don't have such a pleasant environment. Well, I first talked about this, and I'm still in the process of developing the argument that I'll just sort of summarize today. I've written an article based on this, though, that is a kind of a fuller representation of my thinking on this subject, and I think that there may be copies of that available because it hasn't been published yet. It was written for First Things. And if you're in Washington, D.C., there are thousands and thousands of people that I will describe as, that describe themselves as libertarians. And I don't mean the Libertarian Party, I mean small L libertarians. What that essentially means, if you ask them, is they believe in individual rights and economic freedom and reason and responsibility and limited government and things like that. But a lot of these folks are also atheists and materialists philosophically, and many of them actually think that Christianity or theism is hostile to these concerns, ideas of freedom and individual responsibility and individual rights. And honestly, from the very beginning, this seemed obviously to be mistaken, but I was just sort of surprised that there wasn't more discussion of this. And so when people hear I'm going to talk about why libertarians need God, you're probably thinking, okay, he's going to say the libertarians are a bunch of sinners and they need Jesus, right? I do think that, but that's not what I'm planning to talk about today. What I really want to do is to kind of show you philosophically what I think is at stake. Because what I think often happens, and this is the result of the fact that God has embedded the natural law in people's hearts, so the Gentiles do what the law requires, so they have not the law. And so they will believe in certain things that are more or less correct, more or less true, but they won't be reflective about what would need to be true of reality itself in order for those values to be true. And so they may deeply believe in moral realism, for instance, which is just, the idea that moral categories and moral judgments have an objective reality that's out there that we can appeal to. And virtually all libertarians are moral realists, at least in the ways they argue. But there's some views of reality in which that makes sense, and there are other views of reality in which it doesn't make sense. And so what I'm going to argue is that the core libertarian values, and this is how I'm going to define this. So the first would be this idea of individual rights or intrinsic dignity of the individual, that the individual is a pre-existing, pre-political reality that a just and limited state must recognize. Freedom and individual responsibility, which of course implicate themselves. Reason, the idea that we can use inference and our reasoning faculties to arrive at true conclusions. Moral realism, or just the belief that there are moral truths. And limited government. Think of these as the libertarian values. And so what I really want to ask is just simply this. If we take the two main alternatives for the claim about what ultimate reality is like, as materialism on the one hand and theism on the other. Here's the question. In which of these views of reality do those libertarian values make sense? And is one more compatible with these values than the other? That's the only question I want to ask. So this is not an argument for the existence of God directly. It's not an argument for the truths of Christianity per se. It's simply a kind of philosophical exercise to say, look, if you hold those values and you think they're true, then what else would need to be true about the universe and reality itself in order for them to cohere? So you see how there's a philosophical treatment of this. And what's interesting is I don't have to really make this argument myself, because what I want to do here in the next few minutes is just show you what leading materialist philosophers say about the implications of their own view, of their own philosophical materialism. They tell us, Bertrand Russell and B.S. Skinner tell us exactly what their view means for ideas like freedom and responsibility. And then the point is simply to urge people that see themselves as libertarians and hold these values to sort of think about where they would be much more naturally at home theologically. Well, let's go with the first one, individual rights. I mean, this is the one sort of plausibly, just historically, we know that the idea of individual rights comes from a generally Christian and theistic context. It didn't spring up in the first century. It, of course, took centuries in the West for these ideas to be refined, and you had the Magna Carta and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But even a theistic rationalist like Thomas Jefferson, when he writes a Declaration of Independence, roots the idea of rights and human equality in an explicitly theological or theistic context. Of course, excuse me, let me, that Grand Rapids dryness, I remember that. I always kept a tub of Eucerin in the bathroom, I remember, when I lived here in the winter. Here's, of course, a famous quote that Jefferson wrote and then and Benjamin Franklin edited. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that when Jefferson goes, he's wanting to, of course, make a public argument, an argument based on reason, and yet he assumes quite rightly that if you're going to justify the idea that human beings have rights and dignity that ought to be respected and recognized, if you're going to believe that in some sense all the diverse human beings that you see around us are in some fundamental sense equal, it's very difficult to make that claim without a frankly theistic assumption. Because if you're just doing it empirically, on empirical grounds, there's no real way to show that humans are equal. In fact, we're most unequal in all sorts of different ways. We all know that. So that's why most cultures in history have not believed this. They've just said, look, you look around, some people are meant to be slaves, some people are meant to be masters, and that's just the sort of ways of the world. It's only in a theistic and a Christian context, at least initially, that this idea of equality and individual rights crystallized. It's so powerful that, of course, it was in some ways kind of universalized in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. What's interesting, though, is that many people that would not themselves believe in anything like theism, in fact, would be quite vocal atheists, still believe this idea. And I don't know how to account for that, except that it's many people sort of draw on the interest of their cultural heritage, or they simply have access to the natural law. And I could give you examples of sort of Christian-friendly libertarians to prove this point, but I won't do that. I'll pick Ayn Rand, who of course is well known as and probably the most widely read defender of capitalism or the free economy in the 20th century, and also a hardcore atheist who thought Christianity and the free economy were incompatible. And yet even Ayn Rand said this. She said, man, every man is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. Now, the question is, where does that come from exactly? You know, it sounds like the Declaration of Independence. If you're sort of reading Genesis 1, you might get an idea like this, but Rand didn't have any obvious resources in order to justify this. And so what I think this is that it's a sort of a realization of a moral truth that she saw with particular clarity, but it's floating in midair. It doesn't have the kind of philosophical support that it would need in order to make sense. Now, I would quibble maybe with the construction of how she put it. Of course, God is the ultimate end for all of us, but does anybody doubt that she's not onto something when she says, look, we need to treat other people, other persons, as ends in themselves and not merely means for our preferred ends. That's a key insight that even hardcore atheists like Ayn Rand believe. So the question is, okay, if the options are theism or materialism, and you're not going to go with theism, what would materialism say about this idea of individual rights and equality? Well, what's interesting is it's not just that individual rights are hard to justify. The very idea of individuals themselves are hard to understand if you're a materialist. Remember, materialism claims that fundamental reality, the thing from which everything else comes, is blind matter in motion, which over long periods of time kind of comes together in interesting ways. That limits the resources that you can use philosophically. And it turns out it's actually really hard to get this idea of a human individual at all from that. This is how B.F. Skinner put it in his tellingly titled book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. I know it's a little pedantic to give a full quote like this, but I want to sort of establish I'm not making this stuff up. All right, this is Skinner. He says, autonomous man, the idea that these human beings that aren't fully reducible to their environment, has been constructed from our ignorance, and as our understanding increases, the very stuff of which he is composed vanishes. To man qua man, we readily say good riddance. Only by dispossessing him can we turn to the real causes of human behavior. Only then can we turn from the inferred to the observed, from the miraculous to the natural, from the inaccessible to the manipulable. And that's a very stark statement, but this is not an idiosyncratic statement. If you read leading materialist thinkers and philosophers, Skinner, of course, is a psychologist, they'll tell you this, that this idea that there are these individual subjects that can actually sort of evaluate the world around them. Yes, they may be shaped by their heredity and their environment, but they can still somehow transcend that. This just makes absolutely no sense in a materialistic context. And so what Skinner was doing was essentially working out the logical implications of his materialist worldview. Now, of course, it's a kind of self-refuting idea because he himself, no doubt, thought he was a self that could write books and was writing it for somebody, right? There's always that problem, but you know, that's a whole different set of problems, so we don't go into that. So no individuals. Materialism really is finally not clearly compatible even with the existence of individuals, let alone human equality and individual rights. Well, the second, probably most prominent idea in those libertarian values is what we just call freedom. The idea that freedom is a moral good, that freedom for human beings, except when human beings, individuals, are violating the freedom of others, that it's generally a good thing that to be left to exercise their freedom. Now, I'm not going to challenge that. I think freedom is a good thing. I think it's a good thing for some other reason. It's not, by itself a good. It's good because it allows us to flourish and to do things that we're created to do. What's funny is that freedom, this idea, is just utterly passé in philosophical circles that are committed to materialism. It is very hard to find a consistent materialist philosopher that also has a robust sense of what philosophers call libertarian freedom. Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher of the 20th century, made this point. He said, look, if materialism is true, we're ultimately the result of the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, which we had no control over, and then our culture and our general environment. And we're made up, we're the sort of sum of those parts. And so the idea that we would transcend them and have freedom and therefore responsibility just doesn't make sense. Here's how he puts it. He said, when a man acts in ways that annoy us, we wish to think him wicked, and we refuse to face the fact that his annoying behavior is the result of antecedent causes which, if you follow them through long enough, will take you beyond the moment of his birth, and therefore to events for which he cannot be held responsible by any stretch of the imagination. Now again, this is just working out the logical implications of materialism. I mean, here's the sort of basic problem schematically. Is again, if you're a materialist, you have a few tools in your toolkit for explaining things, right? So you probably take for granted the universal constants of physics and the existence of elementary particles and atoms and molecules, stuff like that. It gets a little more complicated, but essentially what you have is that each of us is ultimately the result of countless antecedent causes that we don't have any control over and can't really control. And so in other words, the individual under materialism is just a sum total of nature and nurture. Everything, there's the nature-nurture debate. Are we primarily the result of our upbringing and our culture and our religion, or are we the result of our genetic endowments? And people disagree about which one is predominant, but notice the assumption is that it's the sum total, it reduces to those two categories, right? It's not like, well, okay, many of the things we do are the result of our nature, some are the result of our environment and upbringing, and some are the result of what? Free agency that transcends that? This makes no sense in a materialist view, and Bertrand Russell explained that. This is essentially what libertarian freedom requires. Now, libertarian freedom is actually, that's not a political word. This is a word that philosophers use to refer to the type of freedom that most of us think exists intuitively. It just essentially means that we're capable, despite the fact that we're shaped by all sorts of factors, we are at least sometimes capable of choosing between live alternatives. And the source of that choice is ultimately us as an agent and not something else. And so libertarian freedom requires, certainly incorporates all the facts having to do with nature and nurture, but it also requires the existence of an agent who can choose and make choices. Now, virtually all libertarians assume this philosophical idea of libertarian freedom. But virtually no materialist will defend this idea of libertarian freedom. And if they do, they won't do it in terms of their materialism. So once again, one of these basic libertarian values is undercut. Let's take reason. I've got a quote in the article that we printed out from Ludwig von Mises, who said, libertarianism, or the case for a free economy, appeals to the cool and detached reason of the human mind and does not require kind of emotional appeals. That is, the case for a free economy, the value of private property rights, and limited government and these things. If you'll look at the data empirically and think about the sort of economic realities involved, you should, by reason, follow that evidence to the conclusion and hold the same views that libertarians do on these things. This is often not articulated, but just assumed that reason is valid, that at least sometimes we can use logic and things like that to come to true conclusions. Well, you're not going to be surprised for me to tell you that materialists have consistently said that this idea of reason doesn't really make any sense. And this didn't just happen recently. In fact, Charles Darwin, who famously proposed that biological complexity is primarily the result of a relationship of common ancestry of all organisms, and then a blind mechanism of natural selection and random variation, which in its modern form is blind random genetic mutations in natural selection. So you have an impersonal process that gives rise to things that look like they're designed for a purpose, but according to Darwin, they aren't really designed. And Darwin himself very quickly realized the implications of this view. He said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the conviction of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? All right, now that's just kind of the intuitive worry, right? It's not exactly an argument, but it's like, okay, if we're there, all of our faculties, including our capacity for reason, are the result of these blind and purposeless processes, how confident should we be that these processes actually will work themselves out? This is often called Darwin's doubt, and he articulated it intuitively. A lot of philosophers, I could quote 25 prominent philosophers on this particular subject, say that reason, this idea of truth, that we can acquire it by thinking clearly, is just so much nonsense. And probably, are there any kids in the room? It just occurred, this next slide's a little racy. I don't see any too young people. This is the most colorful articulation of this point from a philosopher named Patricia Churchland, who I think is at UCLA or at MIT now. Here's what she said. She said, boiled down to essentials, the nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensory motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it's geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chance of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. Now, her point is essentially that if materialism and the Darwinian account of evolution are true, right? So you gotta, if you think of sort of evolution, you imagine God guiding it. You can't do that if you're a materialist. It's a blind process. And so all of our faculties, they're ultimately the result of this blind process of natural selection. Natural selection can select for survival enhancing behavior, but it doesn't know what your beliefs are. And there are probably an infinite number of beliefs that are consistent with survival enhancing behavior. And so all natural selection can do is select for, the fact that if there's a lion in the sort of general vicinity, most people run away from that, right? Because early on, presumably, human beings who thought, oh, look, cuddly kitty, right? They get eaten, taken out of the gene pool, right? And then those who run away from the lion survive. But it actually doesn't make any difference what those people believe about the lion. They might think, the lion actually is warm and cuddly, but you got to play hard to get, so you got to run away from him, right? That's just as consistent with the survival enhancing behavior. And so this is Churchill's point. Again, it's kind of an intuitive idea that a lot of people have made. C.S. Lewis made this argument in about 6 pages famously in Miracles. But the most rigorous form is by Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who was at Calvin for many years in Notre Dame, and I think now lives again in Grand Rapids and is teaching at Calvin. Plantinga has been developing what he calls the evolutionary argument against naturalism for, well, as long as I've been following it 20 years. And so in every book that he's written recently, he will sort of perfect this. I think the argument was pretty darn good the first time he made it. But he had a book on science and faith a couple of years ago in which I think he's finally created the final form of this argument. And if this were a different forum, I might actually go through it, but I'm not going to do that. So don't panic. This is his basic argument. It looks kind of fancy and complicated. It's not really that complicated, but it would take me a good half hour to sort of work through it. The central point is this, though. He doesn't say it's logically impossible that we could have reasoning faculties or cognitive faculties that are generally reliable. He just says it's exceedingly unlikely. It's very, very improbable that if naturalism or materialism, as I'm saying, and the Darwinian account of evolution are jointly true, it's highly unlikely that that would produce reliable cognitive faculties and things like reason. Now, what's going on here? Because you might think, well, no, but I mean, if I have a true belief, that confers a survival advantage, so wouldn't natural selection be able to grab onto it? And that's the kind of the first objection people come to when they first hear this argument. But you know, just think of what we'll call the Darwinian backstory, okay? So cosmic history, you've got, you know, what, 10 or 12 billion years of cosmic history without any particular life, and then, you know, 4.5 billion years ago, maybe, or 4 billion years ago, you get the first emergence through some lucky accident of chemistry and physics of the first reproducing organism. And then for a few billion years, you get these simple single-celled organisms. And then you get multicellular organisms, and 500 and some odd million years ago, you suddenly get an explosion of various animal life forms and major phyla that sort of appear over just the course of a few million years. Now, where are beliefs in all this, right? Were those initial bacteria or protobacteria, did they have survival-enhancing beliefs? Well, no, I mean, we assume presumably not, right? And so somewhere probably near the last page of this story, somewhere between the Cambrian explosion and the present, some certain types of, you know, bipedal organisms came to in some way sort of represent certain ideas and to have what we might think of as beliefs. But this blind process of natural selection has been culling for hundreds of millions, or rather billions of years prior to the existence of beliefs. So how likely is it that these beliefs are going to be all that important? That's the dilemma. Now you realize this is one of these self-defeating dilemmas, because if you think this is true, you think, okay, so I'm a materialist and I believe in the Darwinian account of evolution. I think they're both true. So it's probably not all that likely that my rational faculties are reliable, but I'm using my rational faculties to come to materialism and the Darwinian account of evolution, right? So you're sort of in a dilemma here. Now, some people will say, well, look, should I really, I mean, I have so much experience in my cognitive faculties, should I really follow this kind of highfalutin philosophical argument to this conclusion that I should be a skeptic, or should I just, you know, trust my cognitive faculties? That's a good point, but it misses the point of the argument. I would say our cognitive faculties are reliable, and if they're reliable, we need to say what is probably true about reality itself, and so conclude that materialism is probably not true. That's the way to resolve the dilemma. But if you're going to be committed to materialism, you can't do that. So we've lost what? Individual rights and the intrinsic dignity and value of the individual. We've lost reason. We've lost the idea of freedom and responsibility. And it turns out that even the idea of beliefs ends up being problematic in a materialist worldview. If you study philosophy of mind, there are basically two camps on this, and one is called the reductive physicalism or materialism and non-reductive physicalism or materialism. So here's the non-reductive physicalist. I know this is getting kind of up there, but basically says, okay, remember, everything's ultimately the result of physics and chemistry, right? And so what are beliefs? Well, if you're non-reductive, you'd say, yeah, beliefs they're different from a chemical event or a neurophysiological event, but they're ultimately determined by that event. So beliefs is a thing that kind of spins off from some neurological event or pattern in your brain. You admit that they're different, but the beliefs don't have any power to control the neurological structure. The structure determines the beliefs, so it's what you'd call epiphenomenal. The reductive materialist will say, no, there can't be anything like beliefs. That doesn't make sense, because a belief is about certain things. It requires that there be agents that are thinking of some other thing and thinking about it. It has these particular characteristics that just, you don't find that in chemistry, right? A chemical reaction, it's not about some other thing in the same way. So a recent book by Alex Rosenberg called The Atheist's Guide to Reality puts this very starkly. He said, the notion that thoughts are about stuff is illusory. Think of each input-output neural circuit as a single still photo. Now put together a huge number of input-output circuits in the right way. None of them is about anything. Each is just an input-output circuit, firing or not. So there can't be anything like beliefs. Now again, you're probably thinking, wait, but didn't he write a book? You know, and didn't he think people were going to read it? You know, yeah, it's a self-stultifying position, but that's just precisely the point, right? All these things that we more or less take for granted and that libertarians more or less take for granted end up being hugely problematic if you're a materialist. So there's really just sort of one plank left to fall, and it's this idea of moral realism or moral truth. Now, Sam said I live in the Washington, D.C. area, so I have a lot of discussions with people of diverse backgrounds, but a lot of discussions with people that would think of themselves as atheist libertarians. And they all are very hardcore moral realists. That is, they don't think that our moral judgments are just our preferences. They believe in things like the principle of non-coercion, that it's wrong that you should coerce and force someone to do something that they think to be morally repugnant. I think there's something to be said for that. The question is, does moral realism make sense? What would the world have to be like for there to be things like moral truths? Right? Now, in a theistic context, this is actually very easy to account for, and I'll do that in a minute. But for materialism, remember, you've got physics, you've got chemistry, you've got biology. What are moral categories? What exactly is the status of a claim that it is wrong to murder other human beings for the fun of it? Right? It's got to be something else. And again, this is what materialist philosophers will tell you. There's a famous essay about 15 or 20 years ago by Michael Roos and E.O. Wilson, who are very kind of vocal Darwinian materialists. And here's how they describe morality. They said, morality, or more strictly, our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It is without external grounding. Ethics is illusory inasmuch as it persuades us that it has an objective reference. So in other words, natural selection is going to, select for cultures that think, well, people generally shouldn't, eat their children first thing if they get slightly hungry, right? Because there might have been a culture that did that, but again, it wouldn't tend to reproduce, and so natural selection would weed it out of the gene pool. And then those cultures that, for whatever reason, thought, well, we should care for our children and raise them, natural selection will preserve that. And so it makes sense that cultures would have these moral judgments, but it doesn't make sense to think that they have an objective or external reference. Strictly speaking, to say, well, it's wrong to just eat your child the second you feel hunger pains, right? That's good if a culture believes that for Darwinian reasons, but it's not true. It's either nonsense or, strictly speaking, it's false. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, again, I could give you a lot of examples of this, but I just want to show you that these are what the materialists themselves claim are the implications of their own worldview. And then finally, of course, all libertarians believe in limited government. They believe that the government generally, at least in the United States, should be much smaller. It has a legitimate but very limited role to play in maintaining the rule of law and protecting people from being killed and molested by others. But other than that, the government shouldn't be involved in our everyday lives. It should just maybe maintain the conditions that allow us to enjoy free exchange and those kinds of things. Now, I hold all those same things to be true as well. The question is, how do you defend limited government if you don't get to have a reason, you don't even get to have beliefs, you don't get to have the intrinsic dignity and value of the individual, you don't get to have freedom and responsibility or moral truth at all? You can't. I can't imagine how exactly you're going to defend limited government or anything else, because you've undercut the very basis by which you'd make that case. In fact, this is a classic case of what's often called suicidal reasoning, which is essentially, it's the guy sitting on the branch and then he's sawing off the branch between him and the tree, right? I mean, you could do this as long as the saw's on the other side. But suicidal reasoning, you're sawing off the branch you're sitting on. And so if you want to use reason and moral truth and the idea of individual rights and freedom and responsibility in your argument, then you need to figure out a way to do that that's going to be consistent with the other things you believe. But if none of those are consistent with what you think is true about reality, then you're essentially undercutting and defeating the very case that you're trying to make. So the question is how to avoid suicidal reasoning on these particular things. Notice I haven't challenged any of those libertarian values I've talked about. I've simply said, okay, are they consistent with materialism? Well, I think you could show with some definitive conclusion that they're not compatible with the materialist worldview, and that consistent materialists themselves tell us that. So what do you do if you still believe that these things are true and ought to be defended? Well, then I think you should consider, okay, if those are true, what else would need to be true about reality? And so think of this in a Christian and theistic context, in which ultimate reality is not at bottom a blind and purposeless process. It's not these sort of mutable atoms and molecules changing and developing over time. Ultimate reality is a transcendent, perfect, all-knowing, holy, good God, and everything else depends upon that God, that creator, for its existence. So there's a real world, there's real there are matter and physical properties, but these are not ultimate realities, they're derivative realities, and they derive from the free choice of this transcendent creator. Then we learn in the Christian and the Hebrew scriptures, in Genesis 1 and 2, that God creates one creature uniquely in his image. Human beings, man, male, and female. Right? Now, if you look at this, the text, and let's say all you have is a fragment of the Bible, and you just get that first chapter of Genesis, you know nothing else about this God that's described in the text, but you hear that human beings are made in his image. What could you infer? Well, at the very least, you'd say, okay, if we're made in God's image, what's this God like in this text? Well, in the text, God exercises sovereignty over his creation, he exercises freedom, and he exercises creativity. Now, it doesn't follow that we have all those things to the same superlative degree, right? God can call things into existence out of nothing. We don't have that capacity. Nevertheless, I think it stands to reason that being made in the image of God means that in some derivative sense, we also have this capacity to exercise creative freedom. And certainly, a God described as such is much more capable of creating something like this than a blind materialist process. Moreover, moral truths make perfect sense now. You've got a transcendent, holy, good, eternal God who has always existed and can always, at any particular time, can always make particular moral judgments and can create a world that's consistent with that moral reality. Now, I've sort of solved all the philosophical problems we could imagine, but I hope at least I've shown you that if you're going to defend those small L libertarian values, you're much better served being a theist rather than a materialist. Now,
He just actually summarizes it at that point. So, like I said, he's a smart guy, and he talks at a high level.